In this video, we're going to look at a standard LED. Everybody loves them. They're very simple to implement, and I've got some tips and tricks on how to use them effectively when prototyping with Arduino. So let's get started. Number one, LEDs come in all sorts of packages or different sizes. These happen to be common 5mm. They also happen to come in really small size, 3mm. You can also get surface mount LEDs that are extremely small, and even when you look at your Arduino, you can see LEDs blinking away on there. There's a amber one and a green one right on your Arduino. They also come in interesting shapes. This one happens to be in the shape of a candle flame, and when I apply power, it actually flickers a little bit. There are also 10mm LEDs, and this one happens to be a rectangle shaped LED. You'll also notice that this LED is diffused, and that is this cloudy coating on the LED, and it typically gives a softer light to it. It's not such a harsh pinpoint. One of my favorite ones is this one. Again, just two wires coming out of it, but it's actually a square on top. Okay, maybe a little rectangular, but I just love the shape of this one. So there's lots of different options, lots of different shapes. There's also lots of different colors. Now, when you find an LED and you see that it's red, you assume it's red, and generally that's pretty true. But how about all these? I have this little kit that I love having on hand because it gives me 5mm and 3mm LEDs in all of these different colors. And yes, this clear one is also red. Now, how do we test that? Well, anyone who's prototyping with Arduino or prototyping with LEDs should always have one of these batteries handy. It's a CR2032. It's a 3-volt battery, and generally it's safe to hook up to any LEDs. So I can literally just put the long wire, the positive, on the positive side of the battery and the short on the negative, and it lights up. Very nice. Here's that yellow one, positive and negative. And you can see this one's actually diffused on the top, but not on the sides. Really kind of interesting. So this is really helpful to have, especially with these clear LEDs. Like, I had no idea this was going to be a blue one, but now I can put that back in my case as blue. Another thing that's really handy is when you're building a circuit with Arduino, sometimes you'll see people, including myself, take an LED and put the long lead in 13 and the short in ground just to test it. And sure enough, it works. It will blink, but this is really not the proper way to do it. When working with an LED, you should always have a resistor in there. And the reason for that is these LEDs like about 2.2 volts. They're tolerant up to about 3 volts. That's why I use this battery. But if you're using something like an Arduino that has 5 volts on a pin, you don't want 5 volts going into the LED. Does it work? Yes. Should you do it? Probably not. Do lots of people do it? Yes, quite often. But I can't suggest you using that practice in a final product or final project. So I have a couple of tips and tricks with that, and I'll talk about it. Number one, I like to make this. This is a really handy thing to have in your prototyping box. This is just a typical 5mm LED, and I cut the positive lead of the LED off, and I soldered a 220 ohm resistor and went back and soldered the leg back onto the resistor. So there's the leg, a resistor, and the leg again. The reason I add the leg is resistors are typically pretty flimsy compared to the legs of an LED. And now I can take this and just put it right into my prototyping board onto any pin I want and ground it, and I've got a nice, safe LED for testing. Really handy. I also do the same thing, but I put these jumper wires on it. So you can see here's the positive lead, and there's a resistor right in there. You can see the bump right there, and there's another 220 resistor, and I solder it to these nice flexible leads so that I can just plug it into a breadboard and prototype very quickly, very easily, and I don't have to always worry about connecting a resistor. Really good for testing. I highly recommend you make some of these and put them in your box of parts. Now, that being said, I talk about these resistors. Arduino really likes 5 volt, and when working with 5 volt, if you do the calculations with Ohm's law, you can figure out that 220 ohm is actually the ideal resistance for adding an LED to your board. Now, this board I have set up with just the blink sketch, and you can see there's a built-in LED, but I think it's worth quickly prototyping one here so I can show you where the resistor goes. So I've got the long lead, the short lead. The long lead is typically the positive, and when I look at this LED, I also like to look at the inside of the LED, and you can see there's a little cup and a little pointy part on one of them. Typically the cup is a big horizontal, and I like to think of that cup as the negative and the pointy one as the positive. There's also a few other things to indicate positive and negative. Many times you'll see on the edge of the LED a flat spot. That flat spot correlates with the larger cup and also correlates with the shorter lead. So your first indicator is always going to be the lead length, but sometimes I've gotten LEDs where the leads are the same length. And these are some really helpful ways to verify the polarity of the LED. So I'm going to go ahead and put the positive into row 1 and the negative into row 2. Next, I'm going to take a resistor and I'm going to jump it from row 1, let's just say down to row 6. And I will take that, row 6, and jump it over to pin 13. First, I'm going to unplug my Arduino. I'm going to plug that into pin 13 because that's putting out 5 volts. And I'm going to take row 2 and I'm going to connect it over to ground. I'm going to plug my Arduino back in. And now you can see the onboard LED is blinking as well as my offboard LED. And you can see it's quite a bit brighter even though I have that resistor in there. So the resistor really isn't going to affect your brightness too much, but it's going to make your Arduino much happier. It's also going to make your LED much happier because you're reducing the current flowing through the LED. And that's pretty much all you need to know about LEDs when prototyping with Arduino. Keep in mind, when I say standard LED, most people refer to them as a 5mm LED that is 2.2 volts. There are LEDs that have different voltage requirements, and actually different color LEDs will draw more or less current. So you really need to check the specs of your LED when working with them in your project. And you might need to adjust those resistors a little bit or even adjust the voltage a little bit. But a typical LED, one that you find in many of the kits out there, including kits like this that just come with hundreds of them, you'll be good with a 220 ohm resistor and wiring it up very simply like this.